Diolch tá fáilte below gon lecht seo an nom os de Seamus Heaney. Welcome everybody to the 7th annual Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies Seamus Heaney Memorial Lecture. In honor of the poet Seamus Heaney, who won the Nobel Prize in 1995, and who for many people is an embodiment not just of poetry, but of a certain kind of civilization. We're honored this year to have Dr. Rosie Lavan from Trinity College deliver the lecture, and to have Keough-Naughton from the Sorbonne University in Paris as moderator. And I'll introduce Keough in a moment. Seamus Heaney visited Notre Dame twice in 1994 and 2003, and we gave him an honorary degree in 2008. In an interview with Seamus Dean in 1997, Heaney said the following: "Poetry is born out of the watermarks and colorings of the self. But that self, in some ways, takes its spiritual pulse from the inward spiritual structure of the community to which it belongs. I believe that the poet's force is to maintain the efficacy of his own cultural and political colorings, rather than to serve any particular momentary political strategy." These are words that obviously have extraordinary resonance with us still. And in fact, in Dr. Lavan's fantastic work in Heaney, she refers a number of times to not only to this interview, but to another article written by Seamus Dean about Heaney. Seamus Dean had an extraordinary ability to take out of Seamus Heaney the very best and deepest of what he thought. Today is our first day without Seamus Dean. He died last night, as most of you know. He became, as Dean himself said, next to Seamus Heaney, Seamus Ella, the other Seamus. And before I introduce our moderator, I want to say something quickly about the friendship between these two men. First of all, I want to acknowledge that in a very concrete way, none of us would be here if it were not for Seamus Dean, since along with Chris Fox, he founded the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies. Dean at the time was an established intellectual, he was well known, but his best work was still ahead of him at the time. We in Notre Dame are proud that he produced this work while he was at Notre Dame. And it's also a testament to Chris Fox's vision and foresight that he hired him at that time when that work was still to come. In the coming days, I'm sure lots of people will write about the extraordinary body of work that Seamus Dean left. It really is an intellectual and creative legacy that's hard to describe in its complexity and depth. But since this occasion is a Seamus Heaney Memorial Lecture, I want to take just a quick moment to think about that legacy in terms of the lifelong friendship between the two Seamuses. They had literally common ground. They were students together, classmates in St. Colum's College. They were both from County Derry. They were both from Northern Ireland, and from Northern Ireland at a very particular moment in its history in the mid-20th century. But it's typical of Seamus Dean's way of thinking that when he wrote about the relationship for an article in the New Yorker in 2000, he focused on their differences. Dean was a day boy. He came from the city and so went home when school was over, and Seamus Heaney was a boarder. And Dean writes in this essay about what this difference meant. One was urban, one was rural, one played soccer, one played Gaelic. The difference involved different kinds of music, different ways of walking, talking, writing poetry, or interacting with authority and power. And it's typical of Dean that in order to describe in sometimes very lyrical language what the two men had in common, he begins with what they had, what divided them, what their differences were. This attunement to difference as the fundamental common ground of culture and civilization is in evidence in Dean's vision for the Keough-Naughton Institute. When he founded it, he insisted on a historical breadth from the 7th century to the present, and a linguistic one, including not only Irish literature and English, but also founding an Irish language and literature department, which is the only one of its kind in the United States. Similarly, Seamus Dean, like Seamus Heaney, was convinced that the unity of the Irish tradition, the literary tradition, in which they're both firm believers, could yet only be understood in terms of its internal ruptures and contradictions. And this extended in both Seamuses to their view of culture itself. The other common ground they shared beyond County Derry and Northern Ireland was what you might call the World Republic of Letters. They were cosmopolitan, both geographically and chronologically. Both of them knew that the concept of a national literary tradition is meaningless without a sense of the broader international ecosystem in which such traditions are embedded. They knew that the passionate, sometimes narcissistic attention we pay to our own cultural worlds must be matched with an equally dedicated curiosity to what is foreign to cultural ecosystems that seem beyond it. We saw this in Heaney in his wide reading and his translation of ancient and modern languages, and in Dean, right from the beginning in the PhD he did on the French Enlightenment. And there's a podcast from just a couple of years ago in which Seamus Dean talks about Lukács and Rosa Luxemburg, and he talks about them with the same attention to varied local detail as he has when he talks about St. Columb's College in the 1950s. The two Seamuses are also bound by an unquestioned assumption that the work of culture is not just valuable and interesting, but of urgent importance, that it must be enjoyed and taken seriously in equal measure. Most of all, what we see from their lifelong friendship and collaboration is the fact that at its best, the work of culture must be a collective enterprise. We can see that in the institution building that Dean was involved in, both Field Day and Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, but also in a wider sense of listening and addressing one another, to hear and say to other people things that we believe to be true, rather than saying things which we think will help us or garner notoriety. For both the Seamuses, listening and speaking, reading and writing are all creative acts which must be done with care and attention. Heaney dedicated a poem to Seamus Dean called Ministry of Fear. It's a poem that's about institutions and how creative minds and souls are shaped by them. It opens with these lines. Well, as Kavanagh said, we have lived in important places. The lonely scarp of St. Columb's College, where I billeted for 6 years, overlooked your bogside. This idea of important places is a double one. For the idea, I think, is that what they have in common is a sense that the places they are from need to be made important through acts of creative imagination, but also that they must be important and must be listened to. That's how the poem begins. At the end of the poem, Heaney describes a scene in which he's in his car and is pulled over by the B specials, who ask him his name. What's your name, driver? Seamus. Seamus. They once read my letters at a roadblock and shone their torches on your hieroglyphics, svelte dictions in a very florid hand. These hieroglyphics, these svelte dictions, we know, are letters that Seamus Dean wrote to Seamus Heaney. That's what the B specials are looking at with their torch. We're talking about a place, the importance of place, because we're in a place where the name Seamus meant something that had a political and historical resonance. He puts it twice in the poem as a kind of greeting, a wink to Seamus Dean. We see shadows of each other, how the two men are not separable, and also the historical resonance of their name going all the way back to King James. In the words of Seamus Heaney himself talking about this poem, the repeated name implies otherness and brotherness. I'm very struck by the image of the B Special's torch being shone on Seamus Dean's letters, because his novel, as you know, is called Reading in the Dark. He was also a scholar of the Enlightenment, called in French the siècle des Lumières, the century of lights. The poem ends, indeed, with an image of reading and writing and of shared lives, even at a great distance of time and space. The final message I take from this poem about their friendship is that we carry our friends and allies with us, even in their absence, and that their words can illuminate the darkness, even when it's frightening. And that's what I hope we will be able to do in the coming years with our lost friend, founder and ally, Seamus Dean, and the writing he's left to us. It's now my happier task to introduce our moderator for today. Professor Cliona Ní Rúdháin is Professor of English at the University Sorbonne Nouvelle Paris 3, where she teaches Irish literature and translation studies and convenes a master's program in Irish studies. She holds degrees from the National University of Ireland and from the universities of Lyon and Paris. Her research interests lie in contemporary Irish poetry and sociolinguistics. She directs the Irish Studies Research Group, ERIN, and she's the author of a recent terrific book English language poets in University College Cork, 1970 to 1980. And I kept, when I was thinking of the two Seamuses in St. Colum's College and Field Day in Northern Irish Poets, I kept thinking of Clina's work in how institutions shape the creative and literary imagination. She's a longtime ally and collaborator of the Keough-Naughton Institute. She's co-convener of our Global Ulysses project, for example, which will sponsor conferences and events in Paris, Rome, and Dublin in 2022. So thank you for your patience, and Clina, thank you for agreeing to join us today. It's over to you.
Thank you very much, Barry. The phrase, "if we can winter this one out, we can summer anywhere," appeared as graffiti all over Ireland during the first lockdown last year. Chalked on walls, transmitted via social networks, Seamus Heaney's words, which were not even words taken from one of his poems, console the nation in a time of despair and uncertainty. They were a reminder of how Heaney continues to be a public figure, a reminder of how his art offers shield and succor to his readers, and beyond them to civic society as a whole. In the United States also, Heaney's words were drawn upon in the recent presidential election, cited by President Biden on the campaign trail. These recent emblems of Seamus Heaney's importance as a smiling public man, to quote Yeats, also highlighted the importance of the relationship between poet and society. And it is this relationship that lies at the heart of Rosie Lavan's recent monograph, Seamus Heaney and Society, published by Oxford University Press last year. As she said herself, the book seeks to show how Heaney's work in the print broadcast media, in education, and in his de facto role as a public figure shaped his poetry and his ideas about poetry throughout his career. The book, developed from Rosie Lavan's postgraduate work at Oxford under the supervision of Bernard O'Donoghue. However, Dr. Lavan's route to academia was not the straightforward migration of undergraduate to postgraduate. Having read English at St. Anne's College, Oxford, she left to train as a journalist at City University in London. This path took her to the business and finance desk in the Times of London. She also worked as a media assistant to an MEP and for the House of Lords Hansard. In 2010, she returned to Oxford for postgraduate work and was awarded a DPhil 4 years later in 2014. In 2015, she took up a position at the School of English in Trinity College Dublin, where she works today. I would argue that it is in this coal-face engagement with institutions and her immersion into the world of journalism that has made her monograph such a compelling work. It draws on a wide variety of archival sources, ranging from Vogue to the New Statesman to Heaney's broadcasts for BBC Ulster. It is underpinned by the work of Jerome McGann. And it is a compulsively readable book. And rare it is the book in academia that one can take from the desk and pursue under the covers late in the night, reading in the dark, to quote Seamus Dean. Today, Rosie Lavan is co-editing with Bernard O'Donoghue Seamus Heaney's collected poems. Her other publication project, provisionally entitled Watching Ourselves at a Distance, considers poetry and life writing in Ireland in the mid to late 20th century. Heaney is a key figure here too, but she's also looking at a number of other authors, including Pádraig Fallon, John Montague, Evan Boland, Eden O'Brien, and Nell McCafferty, exploring the dynamic between individual and collective experience in Ireland, North and South during the period. For work towards the project, she has held visiting research fellowships at the Moore Institute, NUI Galway, at Emory University in Georgia, at Wake Forest University, North Carolina. Her lecture today is entitled Tuning the Medium, Seamus Heaney and the First Person Plural. Over to you, Rosie.
Well, many thanks indeed, Cliona, for that very generous introduction. And my thanks to you all for attending today. It really is an immense honour to be in your company for this occasion, celebrating Seamus Heaney and his special connection with this great global centre for Irish studies. I'm deeply grateful to Patrick Griffin and Mary Hendrickson for this invitation, and to Barry and Cliona for their introductions. I'd like to acknowledge especially two of the distinguished scholars who've previously given this lecture, Professor Chris Morash and Professor Eve Patton. I'm very fortunate to be among their colleagues at Trinity, and they've provided great inspiration and support to me. There is special resonance in gathering for this event this month. May 2021 marks 55 years since the publication of Seamus Heaney's first collection of poems, Death of a Naturalist. But following Barry's brilliant tribute, we remember that this is also a day of sadness. And so as we think with gratitude and admiration of Seamus Dean's extraordinary legacy, we might also remember that this year will be 70 years since he and Seamus Heaney met as new pupils at St Columb's College in Derry City in 1951, beginning their journeys in literature and education, which, as Heaney said of Dean's own influence on him, have extended and awakened us all. So, in the mid-1980s, Seamus Heaney was at work on a poem which, in an early draft, he called Folk. The poem was recollective and, in a generalised sense, evoking scenes from a shared past. As it developed and found its place among the poems which would comprise Heaney's 1987 collection, The Hall Lantern, it entered the realm of allegory, which, in part, defines that book. A new title, From the Land of Exhaustion, on a heavily annotated typescript page of the growing poem, was amended, first to From the Country of Exhaustion, and then, with another change of mind signalled by another deletion, to From the Canton of Exhaustion. The drafts in the Seamus Heaney papers at the National Library of Ireland do not reveal the moment at which exhaustion gave way to expectation, but at some point it did, and the poem reached its first readers in the Times Literary Supplement in January 1986 under the title From the Canton of Expectation. This three-part poem is my focus today, and I would like to begin by listening to Seamus Heaney reading it.
From the Canton of Expectation. 1. We lived deep in a land of optative moods, under high banked clouds of resignation, a rustle of loss in the phrase, not in our lifetime. The broken nerve when we prayed, vouchsafe or deign, were creditable, sufficient to the day. Once a year we gathered in a field of dance platforms and tents, where children sang songs they had learned by rote in the old language. An auctioneer who had fought in the Brotherhood enumerated the humiliations we always took for granted, but not even he considered this, I think, a call to action. Iron-mouthed loudspeakers shook the air, yet nobody felt blamed. He had confirmed us. When our rebel anthem played the meeting shut, we turned for home and the usual harassment by militiamen on overtime at roadblocks. 2. And next thing, suddenly, this change of mood. Books open in the newly wired kitchens. Young heads that might have dozed a life away against the flanks of milking cows were busy paving and penciling their first causeways across the prescribed texts. The paving stones of quadrangles came next, and a grammar of imperatives, the new age of demands. They would banish the conditional forever, this generation born impervious to the triumph in our cries of deep profundus. Our faith in winning by enduring most, they made anathema, intelligences brightened and unmannerly as crowbars. 3. What looks the strongest has outlived its term. The future lies with what's affirmed from under. These things that corroborated us when we dwelt under the aegis of our stealthy patron, the guardian angel of passivity, now sink a fang of menace in my shoulder. I repeat the word stricken to myself, and stand bareheaded under the banked clouds, edged more and more with brassy thunderlight. I yearn for hammer blows on clinkered planks, the uncompromised report of driven thole pins, to know there is one among us.
The uncompromised report of driven thole pins, to know there is one among us who never swerved from all his instincts told him was right action, who stood his ground in the indicative, whose boat will lift when the cloudburst happens. From the Canton of Expectation is, as you've heard, an atmospheric poem. It begins and ends with the weather, metaphorically in the high banked clouds of resignation in the opening lines of part 1, which are then seen in the sky above the speaker in part 3, edged more and more with brassy thunderlight. Here in part 3, the weather is underpinned by illusion. Helen Wendler, in 2 remarkable readings of the poem, recognises in that figure who stood his ground in part 3 the Noah of the book of Genesis, ready for the deluge and proofed against it. The atmospheres of the poem are prominently modulated by the language of grammar. The different grammatical moods both bind the speaker to and distinguish him from the people who are his companions and subjects. In the move from the optative moods through the grammar of imperatives to the yearned for indicative, time is operating on another front too, because the question of generation conditions parts 1 and 2 of the poem. The other shift is of focus, which again we can register grammatically through Heaney's pronouns, from the accepting we of part 1 to the demanding they of part 2 and the lone I with whom he concludes. My interest in this poem, and indeed others from this period by Heaney, centres on the way he evokes, negotiates, and situates himself in relation to collective experience. My starting point for this is an exchange between Heaney and Denis O'Driscoll in Stepping Stones, interviews with Seamus Heaney, which you see now on this next slide. So, in this quotation, O'Driscoll is pointing to a shift between Heaney's first collection, Death of a Naturalist of 1966, and his second, Door into the Dark of 1969. And he asks Heaney, what prompted you to make this shift? And in what sense, from what vantage point do you feel you became a we poet? And Heaney replies, I suppose I could say by writing we poems. But no, this brings us back to the question of justifying the art and to the question of the autobiographical and its status in the poems. And O'Driscoll comes back, but isn't it perfectly valid to retain an I perspective and become in the process a truly representative poet? Might you have been developing a sense of poetry as a public art? And Heaney replies, if you put it like that, I suppose I have to agree. When I made the remark about changing from I was thinking of poems like Requiem for the Croppies and Bogland, and obviously the vantage point from which they were written was that of a Northern Irish Catholic with a nationalist background. From the beginning, I was conscious of the need to voice something that hadn't got voiced, to tune the medium in order to do that particular job. There was an element of transgression in celebrating the Croppies in official Ulster in 1966, and there was an implied alternative to the British connection in making the Bog of Allen the mythic centre. Yet I also have to say this, what pleased me most about Bogland wasn't its theme or its first person plural, but the fact that it had been given, had come freely, had arrived out of old layers of language or law and language, and felt completely trustworthy as a poem. It might have said we, but it was still all me. As it happens, Requiem for the Croppies and Bogland are the only poems in Door into the Dark which employ the first person plural, so this shift may have been more perceived than actual. Heaney's response to O'Driscoll's first question here is initially perhaps enigmatic. He doesn't expand on the way in which this shift of pronouns forces the justification of the art, and then apparently more direct, though the autobiographical and its status is not as clear as it seems. How do we understand and measure the status of the autobiographical? Is he thinking solely in terms of the truth? Is status a euphemism for the translation which the autobiographical undergoes in the making of a lyric poem? And are we to understand that status differently in a clearly autobiographical poem like Heaney's celebrated Digging, for example, than in another clearly autobiographical poem like From the Canton of Expectation, where we joins I? O'Driscoll pursues the point and expands the terms of the question, pulling the autobiographical into dialogue with the representative and then the public. From here, Heaney offers an account of his emergence as a poet in the familiar, politicized terms of his background. Poetry is freighted with the possibility, or as Heaney puts it, the need, to voice something that hadn't got voiced. This redress demands that the chosen art be modified, hence the need to tune the medium. Becoming a poet means adapting the poem, altering its capacities for self-expression, or rather recognizing and asserting those capacities, to hold and convey aspects of his own and his community's experience. But ultimately, the origins and achievement of one of the poems mentioned here, Bogland, remain a private matter. It may have said we, but it was still all me. The exclusion of Requiem for the Cruppies in the closing lines of this passage is important, but not unexpected. This sonnet, which was first published in summer 1966, amid the commemorations of the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising, imagines the local revolutionaries, the Cruppies of the Irish Rebellion of 1798, on the run before their fatal encounter with the British Army on Vinegar Hill in County Wexford. It is famously remembered as a poem that went unread by Heaney in public for almost 3 decades. A recitation of the poem was included on a record of rebel songs called The Four Green Fields in 1971, and after this and the hardening of sectarian positions during the early Troubles, Heaney left the poem to one side, for fear of implying or stoking Republican convictions. But remarkably, his caution about it was not absolute. He did read Requiem for the Cruppies for an audience at Harvard in 1975, during his first public reading at the university. This is an exercise of freedom which is inconceivable in the social media age, and signals Heaney's concern with the effect of the collective pronoun on his audiences, where there was a risk of immediate identification with the we and our of this poem of political and historical memory, or of vehement resistance to them. The poem could not be shared. But in the United States, the pronouns of Requiem for the Cruppies presumably seemed less problematic because more remote. I suggested just now that the shift from I to we between Heaney's first 2 books may have been more perceived than actual. This relates to an important tension which is central to the critical background of my discussion and which picks up on one of O'Driscoll's terms. This is the extent to which Heaney was seen as a representative poet. For some, this was a deeply provocative suggestion. David Lloyd, writing in 1985 as the Hall Lantern poems were taking shape, resisted the elevation of Seamus Heaney and the values of coherence and unity his champions identified in his poetry. Lloyd was preoccupied by the fallacy of identity he discerned in Heaney's work, quote, envisaged as at once constitutive and expressive of an identity liberated from the incoherent unity of its ground. Other demanding critics of Heaney have been concerned with the same issue. Peter MacDonald, although very differently provoked into these considerations than Lloyd, still wanted to interrogate the terms of Heaney's reception. In 1997, MacDonald asserted that Heaney is, quote, in fact, a much more complex figure than is recognised in much favourable criticism, and his work, quote, relates to notions of identity in various and variously questioning ways. More recently, Eric Falke, in his alert rereading of Lloyd, argued that, quote, if there is a model of the poet that emphasises its representativity and exemplarity, then it is drawn to look like Seamus Heaney. But for all of Heaney's centralising tendencies, the poet as spokesperson, as conduit for the community and of history, as embodiment of Irish identity, intense dislocations often enable such seemingly solid gravid positioning. Falke stresses a stranger, more internally fissured Heaney than the version of the poet allowed by the literary criticism, which follows the terms Heaney himself prescribed. And he raises an issue with which every serious critic must address. That is, Heaney's careful management of his own reception, which took place most often beyond the poetry. This has become more visible since the deposit of Heaney's papers in the National Library of Ireland by the poet himself in 2011, and also, crucially, since the publication of Stepping Stones in 2008. Heaney's interviews with O'Driscoll are the closest he came, beyond his poetry, to producing an autobiography. Falke's remarks return us to the final words in the passage from Stepping Stones, which is still on the slide. Bogland may have said we, but it was still all me. This is a characteristic Heaney statement, at once economical and euphonious, and it is essential to this discussion. Bogland is dedicated to the painter T.P. Flanagan, who had, in 1967, dedicated this painting to Heaney. It is the final poem in Door into the Dark, and its prescience as, in Roy Foster's words, quote, a step into the metaphor for the memory of historical violence which would become famous and controversial in Heaney's 1975 volume North, is often asserted. The poem surveys the quintessential Irish landscape, offsetting it with references to the prairies of North America, and meditating on the history preserved and occasionally revealed in the bog. Discussing the poems of Door into the Dark in his recent study of Heaney, Foster looks to Stepping Stones and Heaney's acknowledgement that his year in the United States as a visiting professor at Berkeley in 1970 to 71 shifted profoundly his sense of himself and the ways in which he might relate to Ireland, thanks in no small part to his influential friendship with the novelist Thomas Flanagan. I was starting to see my situation as a northern poet more in relation to the wound and the work of Ireland as a whole, Heaney told O'Driscoll. The immediate consequences of that reckoning were his volumes of the 1970s, preeminently North. But I want to shift these insights forward nearly 2 decades to meet the Heaney of the Hall Lantern, a poem changed and in some significant respects chastened by the dialogue with himself over the obligation to confront events in Northern Ireland and the eternal attendant questions about the adequacy and legitimacy of such confrontation through poetry. Both Fieldwork of 1979 and Station Island of 1984 are major and widely lauded endeavours to retune the medium in order that it might voice what Heaney felt he needed to express. As the successor to these volumes, the Hall Lantern, for some of its first critics, suffered by comparison. In Bernard O'Donoghue's summary, the Hall Lantern was seen as a highly effective and affecting book of personal poems, which turned inward the major focus of its predecessor, Station Island, with a loss of power and a rather Mandarin slightness. Wendler categorises the Hall Lantern as an intellectual volume. It ponders, it values, it chooses, it judges. Heaney's great innovation in the book was certainly the product of his sustained personal and academic interest in the modern poetry of Central and Eastern Europe, which emerges here in the so-called parable poems, among them from the Canton of Expectation. As Wendler notes, this is the most autobiographical of these sometimes strange and challenging poems. It situates us, the reader, in the shared world of the speaker's community, conditioned by perennially unfulfilled hope. This is the group Conor Cruise O'Brien called in his perturbed review of North, not incorrectly, but also not unproblematically, the Catholics of Northern Ireland. Their condition is expressed in the tired but cherished truisms of political disappointment, not in our lifetime, and obedient, imploring prayer, vouchsafe and deign. But the stance and experience expressed through these well-worn words are deemed in the poem creditable, sufficient to the day. And this shows us Heaney conferring some precious dignity on a time and a place which he may imply are naive and limited by faith and acquiescence, but which earn nonetheless his protection because of their tender, primal familiarity. I cannot help but discern here the almost sacred anonymities of the poem The Seed Cutters in North, which makes a sympathetic appeal to Bruegel, fellow artist of the rural. These anonymities are carried forward into other poems of silent tradition and recovery. Squarings 42 in Seeing Things, for example, where Heaney conjures, quote, the fields of the nearly blessed, where gaunt ones in their shirt sleeves stooped and dug, or stood alone at dusk, surveying bog banks. Or The Woman and Child at the Easter Fair in Toon in 1944, remembered in one of Heaney's great World War II poems, The Aerodrome in District and Circle of 2006. Wherever the world was, we were somewhere else, had been and would be, says Heaney's speaker, revising the verbs of the Glory Be. That fair day in the aerodrome is prefigured in the memory of the Feis in From the Canton of Expectation, with its traditional dancing, songs sung in Irish, and the auctioneer, the veteran orator who addresses the gathering. The only variants from the first published version of this poem in the Times Literary Supplement occur in this section. The first is the minor but not insignificant shift from our humiliations in the TLS to the non-possessive but still personal the humiliations we always took for granted. The second is the weary précis of those humiliations which the TLS version offers, the whole backlog of outrage and exaction. Exaction, that sense of demand which we know in the land of optative moods has been disappointed, interestingly shadows the unrelenting demands of the younger generation of part 2 of the poem. The cancelled line also bears traces of the exhaustion which appeared in the title of drafts of the poem. The auctioneer's historical litany is long, but it has long since lost its vitality. I am particularly struck by that interjection, I think, in the recollection in the final line of the passage on this slide. Not even he considered this, I think, a call to action. This past no longer smoulders as a call to action. There is absolution here, or at least nobody felt blamed, and there is confirmation in what part 3 of the poem calls these things that corroborated us. The change of mood in part 2 comes suddenly. The busy focus of this central section of the poem with its drive and modernity is reflected not only in those alliterated participles which dramatize the concentration of a newly educated generation, paving and penciling their first causeways across the prescribed texts, but also in the relative formal stability of this section. The tripartite structure of the poem is unbalanced by the irregular lengths of parts 1 and 3, but part 2, a blank verse, largely regular pentameter sonnet, stands between them with a kind of formal surety. This account of the journey of education out of the quiet pieties of rural life and into an era of clear-voiced and unmannerly agitation for change is, of course, the journey of Heaney's own generation. While this narrative of liberation and achievement can be invoked earnestly in affirmative terms, and during her presidency, Mary McAleese cited From the Canton of Expectation twice on official business, emboldening her audiences with the example of the escape from the curtailed and deprived existence of Northern Catholic nationalist communities via education and the civil rights movement of the late 1960s, it is also vulnerable to cliché. In an astute survey of Northern poetry in 1979, Elaine Naquilinon suggested that, quote, the typical poem of the new era in the North is the 11-plus scholarship poem, alluding to the crucial exam which set many children, Heaney included, on an academic path previously unavailable to their families, and Naquilinon cited Heaney's digging as one of her chief examples. Heaney very pointedly distances his speaker from either possibility. Wendler suggests that he adopts in the poem the voice of one of the older generation evoked in part 1, but I would resist certainty on that attribution while still mindful of the closing lines of part 2, our faith in winning by enduring most. I say this because of what the retrospective view of the poem's speaker encompasses and offers. That tellingly evaluative, I think, in part 1 is key to this. So too is the fact that despite the acknowledged difference of the younger generation, marked apart by the third person plural they are still closely involved with the we of the poem. The complicated and undeniable distance between different generations within a community or national group recalls Anne Enright's exploration of these issues in an essay in the brilliant book of photographs, Magnum Ireland, which accompanied a 2006 exhibition of images of Ireland by members of the Magnum Photo Agency, covering the period from the 1950s to the 2000s. Surveying photographs taken in the first years of the new millennium, Enright noted with breezily ironic approval that the young people of the 2000s were taller and had better skin than her own generation. This bright, happy Ireland, she wrote, has the youngest population in Europe, and now they have grown up. But are they still us? Enright's question can be eternally renewed and universally applied, but recognised here in the generational dynamic of From the Canton of Expectation, it comes under the specific pressures active on the Northern Ireland in which Heaney was born, grew up, and began to write. It is worth stating the obvious, particularly in this month, which marks the centenary of partition and the establishment of Northern Ireland, that while the auctioneer's humiliations were time old, the Northern Ireland in the background of the poem was very young, despite the fact that the inequalities it upheld took root quickly. When Heaney was writing this poem in the mid-1980s, he was feeling profoundly the effects of the collisions of personal and collective experience in Ireland, north and south. The 80s, he told O'Driscoll, was a decade of considerable dismay in Ireland and in myself. It began with the hunger strikes, and as it proceeded, the stalemate in the north showed no signs of being broken, nor did the violence show any signs of abating. People in the nationalist camp were caught between the provisional killers and the revisionist historians. In some respectable quarters, green became a term of abuse. Romantic Ireland died again, or rather, it was put to death because of the crimes of the provos and the crimes of the patriarchy. I felt unmoored from much that I had grown up with. This self-commentary casts light back on the generational affiliations of From the Canton of Expectation, if we sense, as I think we might, a complicated nostalgia expressed through protectiveness in parts 1 and 2 of the poem. Certainly it illuminates part 3 and its yearnings. This response from Heaney in Stepping Stones comes after O'Driscoll asks him whether the poem which concludes the Hall Anthem, the riddle, signalled that he felt uncertain about where to turn next, and whether that, in turn, suggested a revival of the spirit of his early Latin pseudonym, Incertus, under which his first poems appeared in student magazines. Heaney asserts that Incertus never really left, which surely accounts for the wish for the emphatic, battened-down decisiveness in the arc-building imagery of part 3. Here, as the poem concludes, we and they have been left behind, and I stands now under the heavy sky, unhappily assailed by the remembered guarantees of the guardian passivity, which have become reproachful and menacing. In the closing lines of the poem, I yearn to know there is one among us who never swerved. The speaker has much in common with the philosopher Diogenes, as Heaney depicts him in the title poem of the Hall Anthem, roaming and seeking one just man. The indicative mood, with its clarity and assertion, is positioned as the grounded alternative to the moods of desire and demand, and associated solely with the singular speaker. And yet, of course, Incertus was a role, a guise. Control and decision were always at play in Heaney's poetics. In an analysis of From the Canton of Expectation, shortly after the Hall Anthem was published, Bendler discussed Heaney's shift to allegory, a move which she said was one of the most decisive a writer can make. There is a reassuring view of the use of allegory, she argues, which is that it can facilitate a comparison of events in different times and places, which leads, through parable, to sympathy and solidarity. But, she goes on, there is another view which would see a written allegory as the trace of an earlier felt despair. In every allegory, written parable has displaced historical event. smoothing out to some degree the idiosyncratic, the local, and the particular in favour of the widely shared, the intelligible, the ahistorical. Writing is used to efface the pangs of immediate experience. Universal, timeless nature or necessity soothes the irritability of the ungovernable, personal present. As a gloss on the function of mode from the canton of expectation, this is extraordinarily perceptive. And Wendler's argument is reinforced when we revisit the draft titles of the poem. Folk, the first mooted title, may, in its anonymous, vernacular way, have fit the widely shared ahistorical bill. But more interesting and complicated is Heaney's journey from the land or the country of exhaustion to the title on which he finally settled. Exhaustion bears the pangs of immediate experience, as he later acknowledged he felt them in the 1980s, and it gives to the poem a sense of aftermath, if not of absolute conclusion. Expectation, instead, is a suspended condition, no less a burden, as those optative moods proved, but not divested of its alternative potential, as the new Noah anticipates the cloudburst. Still more eloquent is Heaney's choice of the word canton over land or country. This strains perhaps immediate intelligibility because of its relative obscurity, but it proves a liberation from the fraught and contested nomenclature of the place in which Heaney was born: Northern Ireland, the North, Ulster, the 6 counties, the state, the province. The canton, instead, is suspended too, and it takes its own place in the imagined cartography of the Hall Lantern, which encompasses in its poems the frontier of writing, the republic of conscience, the land of the unspoken, and Parable Island. We should not neglect either the preposition, as Stan Smith reminds us in his excellent reading of this volume. The preposition from, in one sense, simply indicates the place of origin of the missive, he says, but, quote, that from carries more weight than this. Heaney writes from the frontier, but he also experiences a sense of release at having come away from, escaped across it. From the Canton of Expectation is a great autobiographical poem of emergence too, but it also proves that release through parable does not preclude return in memory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosie, for this illuminating reading. Like all of the best readings of a poet's work, your lecture sends us back to the writing itself. It returns us to the close reading of the text. And in the supplements that you bestow upon us via your sojourn in the archives, we contemplate again the importance of parts of speech, the pressure of grammar, the materiality of language. Most of all, I think, we picture Heaney alone in the scriptorium, conscious of the critical hum that you referred to when you evoked David Lloyd and Peter MacDonald, a critical hum that enveloped him both within and, I would suggest, without the academy, because Heaney's poetry was also referred to by popular commentators in newspapers such as the Sunday Independent. I think to come back to Seamus Deane, whom we've remembered at the beginning of this lecture, Heaney was acutely aware of the truth of Seamus Deane's statement: literary texts are curious. They exist as recurrent events in literary history, rather than as a fixed series of literary facts. And in a sense, I'd like to suggest that your genetic criticism that you proposed to us this evening has allowed us to understand how Heaney attempted to defy that statement. I come back to the way in which you concluded your talk when you referred to the way in which Heaney stripped from the canton of expectation of the tendentious terms such as folk, land, and country for the more sober Swiss landing canton. But for me, as a French speaker, in any case, it's etymological overtones of cotonner, and the French meaning hemmed in and limited by. And as such, it makes it a term which is both unhinged by a romantic ideology and yet no less problematic. A term, I think, which can be seen, as you suggested, as of a piece with the shift in the Heaney canon to allegory. The shift also from exhaustion to expectation can be read as indicative of a theme that has been mined, the exhaustion of the cliché that dot the first section of the poem. The urgency Heaney feels in avoiding them may correspond perhaps to a moment of self-perception in a more cosmopolitan existence. And I would suggest that we Irish readers, contemporary Irish readers perhaps, with our memory of the recent decades, can decode the references that occupy the first and second sections to references to rebel anthems and roadblocks. But I think in the combined parsing of history and grammar, Heaney strives for a first-person plural that pushes beyond the quarrels of land and country into a global sphere, a universalism which perhaps will lead these particular poems to be read in the future, as Jahan Ramzani has indicated in his recent volume entitled Poetry in a Global Age, as poetry from around the globe, read out of an Irish background. I wonder if we can see this poem and the parable poems in general as an attempt to encompass a we that is not attached to land or country. And yet, as you so astutely pointed out, despite all the rewriting and reworking, the poem is anchored, I think perhaps pinned is the word I should use, pinned by the driven coal pin, the connection that connects this poem to Heaney's translation of Beowulf, and from there beyond to the diction of Ulster English. And so the parable achieves a universal reach, a universal we. However, it does so via an I that remains intensely local.
Thank you very much.
We have a question from Eve Patton, who says, at what point do you sense irony in Heaney's pronouns? And at what point, if at all, a naivety?
I think that's such an important question, because I think it's shaped for me by the fact that these poems can be reread through Heaney's later, reflections on those questions of the kinds of questions that Dennis O'Driscoll explores so brilliantly with him in Stepping Stones, these questions of allegiance, of collective experience. And I think Heaney does actually change the way he thinks about these issues in later life. Ciana's response put these things so brilliantly, and I think raising that question of translation and perhaps a kind of greater fluidity and potential that might come with a detachment or an evolution from the local and yet remain grounded in it is so important. And of course, Beowulf, an extract from his translation of Beowulf indeed appeared for the first time in the Hall Lantern, and then we come to the introduction to his translation of Beowulf published in 1999, where he certainly is, in his post-Nobel way, I think, articulating very much a kind of global, humane vision for the idea of literature offering a kind of access to an understanding of suffering. But at the same time, it's about this time in the late 90s and early 2000s, which I think Heaney seems to be increasingly finding himself less able to relate to contemporary Ireland, and certainly to relate to things like affluence and the expression of affluence, and the way that he explores that with Dennis O'Driscoll in stepping stones is very interesting and perhaps reinforces more of the naivety perhaps than the irony. And I think that's why these poems and the questions they raise are so compelling, because there is a sense in which we might say, well, is there something quite conservative about the stance that Heaney is exploring? You know, why does he seem so ill at ease with with that younger generation in part two, a 1960s generation who are, unquestionably progressive as he was himself? What's going on there? So I think, in a sense, that kind of tug between naivety and irony is a very difficult one to assess, and I think it changes as we read Heaney through Heaney, if that makes sense. Certainly as we read Heaney through the commentary.
Barry has a question. He says, thank you for this talk, which was so equally attuned to big questions and textual detail. And he wonders if the shipbuilding imagery regarding Noah's Ark has a resonance also with Belfast shipbuilding, a sectarian defined trade.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really fascinating point. And even the kind of, I think it must do, surely, the evocation, the noise even that we get in that kind of final section. And I suppose that suggests another kind of certainty, which is a problematic certainty that obviously Heaney expressed in that very early poem Docker, although famously he slightly confused the sort of the sectarian lines along which employment in the Belfast shipyards worked. But I think that must be there, and interesting too, because it's a kind of, that's an earlier kind of idea of work, which is obviously very important to Heaney too, if we think of digging and his rural background and the kind of idea of a work that he was not going to pursue, and of course the work in the shipyards and a kind of industrialized certainty of destiny, of generational identity that's kind of defined through employment, has a correlation there, definitely.
Okay, thank you very much, Rosie. And I think I am not the only Heaney scholar who is eagerly awaiting the publication of the collected poems. So we look forward to that and to reading your next work. Thank you everybody for attending, and we'll say good evening for the Europeans and good afternoon for the Americans who joined us.